several months ago, Mark and I were having a conversation, and we were talking about the metrics that authors follow, and he said, I could maybe do a little presentation for you on that. And I said, wonderful. And I said, I really want you to do it for my authors first, and then we can maybe offer it as a master class. So, Mark, I'm just going to let you take it away. Tell them about your book. Tell them about your expertise, and share with us what you can help us with in terms of metrics.
Sure. Well, thank you, Kathy, for letting me share some ideas here. As far as background, I've had 2 books published through traditional publishers before. And even though I've written and been published working with Kathy, somebody introduced me to Kathy, and has been incredibly helpful in terms of getting the book written. I'm self-publishing the book, and as Kathy mentioned, I got the ebook out to market last August through Kindle, Apple Books, and another platform I've used called LeanPub. And the paperback, I've just been looking at the PDF of the interior layout of the book. There are a lot of charts and graphs in the book because it's a book about metrics. So it's a rather complex layout exercise. There's about 120 figures in the book. But the book, as Kathy mentioned, measures of success. Try to summarize the idea of the methods in the book in the subtitle. If we react less as leaders in an organization, or if we really react less as authors who look at our metrics, we could lead better, whether we're leading others or I guess leading our own book writing and promotion efforts, and we can improve more, because I found a lot of people end up wasting time overreacting or stressing out about relatively small changes in our metrics. And with my background as an industrial engineer and with an MBA, there are some lessons that I've learned from really the industrial engineering and statistics fields that are really applicable to metrics in a lot of different settings. And so that's why I wrote the book, and want to share some thoughts that I think will be of particular interest to the group as authors. So I'll go ahead and dive in.
Yes, please do.
We might have all heard this expression. I hear it a lot. What gets measured gets managed. We see this in email signatures. It gets used in books and presentations. And of this phrase, I think a lot of the focus is on the what gets measured. If we only measure the right things and set the right goals, everything else will sort itself out. But I think it's a really important and interesting question to ask. Not just what do we measure, but how do we manage? How do we improve? So before getting into that, we can ask about what we measure. As authors, there's all sorts of things we look at. Book sales, of course, traffic to our website, social media engagements, video views, newsletter subscribers, revenue for our business. I know a lot of you are also speaking and consulting like I do. So there's a lot of things we could measure. But I think it's important to step back sometimes and ask, well, what are the right metrics? Just because something is easy to measure, or just because we get an email sent to us every week or every month or every 6 months from a publisher, it doesn't mean that the things that are easy to measure are necessarily the right things to look at. So I've learned a lot from, there's an author, Eric Ries, who's written a couple of books. The first was called The Lean Startup, and then the second one is called The Startup Way. And I think as authors, I think it's really helpful to view a book as a startup and to try to learn lessons from the world of entrepreneurship and some of the latest practices there. But in Eric's most recent book, he said something interesting, I thought. The fact that your website has seen an uptick in visitors doesn't mean that your product is more popular or that you're more successful. So in our case as authors, that might be, again, book sales, speaking engagements, the revenue of our overall business. An uptick in visitors to our website may or may not translate to more book sales or more speaking engagements. And an uptick, and I'll show some charts and some examples where an uptick doesn't mean that there's a meaningful increase in the number of visitors that we have to our website. So again, there are these two questions of what do we measure and how do we decide if it's changing in a significant way. Eric uses a clever phrase when he talks about vanity metrics, and I thought this photo illustrated it well. A vanity metric is something that you look at that makes you look better than you might really be doing. There are a lot of things that we could measure or look at. I'm not a big Instagram person, but Instagram likes might make us feel good, but maybe that doesn't sell any books. The number of Twitter followers, blog post views, some of those things might be in that category of metrics that are interesting, but maybe not real helpful to our business. So I think things that really get to the bottom line, book sales, speaking revenue, things like that are decidedly not vanity metrics. One other way of defining a vanity metric is, you don't get paid for Instagram likes. That's probably a vanity metric, unless your book maybe is in a certain market where Instagram is really important. But I want to focus more on what do we do with the right metrics. So I might have a reasonable hypothesis that blog traffic and blog engagement is building followers and an audience that's going to lead to more book sales. But as I sort of come to think, with my own book, and I think that this phrase is actually in the book as I'm explaining these ideas, the fact that your website has seen an uptick in visitors, kind of borrowing Eric Ries's phrase here, an uptick in visitors doesn't mean your site is getting more visitors. And you might think, well, wait a minute. Well, an increase in visitors clearly means I'm getting more web traffic. But we want to start learning the difference between just a fluctuation in the metric and something that's a more meaningful shift. Because a lot of metrics we see, they go up, they go down. All those fluctuations might not be worth analyzing or spending a lot of time thinking about. So if you've got a web page and you use Google Analytics, you might get these emails from them every month, and they make me cringe because all it does is compare this, the last month's performance to the previous month. So here's an example. November last year, you might call this a downtick in visitors. Traffic was down 9.16%. What does that mean? Other than it's down, what does it really meaningfully mean? It's down 9.16%. But how do we put that number in context? Don Wheeler, who wrote the foreword for my book, he wrote a book that's very influential in this space called Understanding Variation. And Dr. Wheeler says, without context, data have no meaning. So let's go back and look at this Google Analytics email. I have 18.4 thousand visitors to my blog. That traffic's down 9.1%. I think the more important question is, what should we do about that? What does that number mean? What decisions or changes should we make? How worried or upset should we be about that number? Is there anything that we should change in the way we run our business? Mm-hmm. So learning about statistics teaches us that, 2 data points are not a trend. And we see a lot of 2 data point comparisons. So again, I had a 9.16% drop. I saved these Google emails. The month before, there was a 9.77% increase. The month before that had a 6.91% increase. So this might be one of those examples where the metric goes up, the metric goes down. It's fluctuating within a certain predictable range, and we can learn to not overreact to that. And there's a little math we can put to that, which I'll get to in a minute. So if we say 2 data points are not a trend, 4 data points might not be a meaningful trend. And if there is a trend, it's really hard to determine that if, again, all we're looking at is percentage up, percentage down compared to the previous month or compared to the previous year. So one of my favorite geeky Twitter hashtags is hashtag plot the dots. And there's actually a group of people who work in the British National Health Service who use the methodologies that I've written about to analyze performance metrics in their health system. And so they're constantly reminding people, when in doubt, draw a chart, draw a graph, if you will, plot the dots. Don't just look at these 2 data point comparisons of, let's say, they would call it A&E, accident and emergency. We would call it ER. ER waiting times are down 10 minutes from the previous month. Is that a meaningful difference? Does that mean they're improving? Does it mean the metric is just fluctuating? So looking at Google Analytics data, if I pull up my iPhone app, it shows me again, it's still kind of biased toward a comparison against the previous week. My web traffic was up 9.86%. And they show two charts of the previous 7 days compared to the 7 days before. So this is a little bit more helpful than just having 2 data point comparisons. But again, the context is limited. This is just 2 weeks worth of data. So if you actually go log in on the web to Google Analytics, you can pull up a chart like this. Here's 2 years worth of website data. So the solid blue line was basically 2018. The dotted line that you see behind was 2017. So now you start getting a more complete picture of looking to see, well, does my web traffic just naturally fluctuate? It drops at the end of the year because of the holidays. It's up, it's down. But now we might look and say, that data point looks significant. And statistically, it is. Back in 2017, I wrote a blog post about the Oscars. And if you remember, poor Warren Beatty and Annette Bening read the wrong winner for Best Picture. And so I wrote a blog post analyzing from kind of an engineering and a lean manufacturing perspective how could that happen? Why we shouldn't blame Warren Beatty for reading the wrong name? How could you improve that system to prevent an error like that from occurring? So because it was a really topical blog post, it did really well in Google results, and I had a huge spike in web traffic. But then you can see, well, the people who read that article about the Oscars didn't keep coming back to the blog. That spike in traffic didn't do anything to increase my general blog traffic at all. So we can look at book sales data in a similar way. If you have a downtick or an uptick in sales, it doesn't mean you're selling significantly fewer books or that you have a trend. There are methods that I share in my book, Measures of Success, and I'll get to in a minute, that help us understand if a change in the metric is meaningful and if it's worth reacting to or investigating, or if it's just what we call noise in the system. So, the traditional publisher I've worked with, one of the things that, I know this is not the topic of the webinar, but one of my grumbles about traditional publishing is that they only share data with you every 6 months, or at least my publisher did, as opposed to Amazon, where you could look at data every day, or even more than that, maybe to an unhealthy level of reloading the page and see, have I sold another book or not? But my publisher would send a royalty statement, and they would send another royalty statement. And, if I draw a chart with 2 data points, and I'm like, well, is my book becoming, or the 2 books through them, like, I don't know from 2 data points, is this a trend that's continuing to go down as the books age, or do the numbers just fluctuate? I would love to see monthly numbers. That would give me better context to understand if this difference in book sales is significant or not. So again, the number for the first half of 2018 was clearly lower than the previous 6 months. But from these 2 data points, it's really hard for me to project, again, is this part of a linear trend going down, or is it just fluctuating? So it comes back to the question of, what do we do with the metrics we're looking at? Should we react? Should we make changes to our marketing strategy or not? So I think one of the facts of life that we have to sort of come to accept is that there will be variation in every metric over time. If we look at metrics that we could track in our personal life, you weigh yourself every morning. Even if your weight is stable over time, it's going to be a little bit different for each person. But when I was charting this at one point, my weight would sometimes fluctuate up or down a pound or 2 every day or every couple of days. And that's due to a number of reasons. It's not necessarily indicative. If your weight goes up by a pound, it might likely go down a pound the next day. So we can, by sort of, if you will, plotting the dots and using some statistical methods, we can learn to not overreact to every minor fluctuation in a metric, and instead look for meaningful trends to see if your weight or your heart rate is getting out of control in some way. So, my Fitbit measures my resting heart rate, and guess what? That fluctuates a little bit every day. Last August, a couple of days before the ebook was done, actually, I got a really bad stomach flu, and my resting heart rate jumped up to about 120, even though I was laying in bed with a pretty bad fever. Like, that was a statistically meaningful difference in my heart rate. That was a temporary thing, thankfully, for a couple of days. Now, if I was getting really, really unhealthy, my weight might be the same, but my resting heart rate might be getting significantly worse, or your blood pressure, or some other personal metric. You can chart, if you drive to an office every day, how long does it take to drive to work? That number will fluctuate. So, we can learn, again, the lesson here is that there will be variation in every metric. The question is, how much variation is routine, or how much variation is normal? We'll come back to my kind of hero and mentor, Don Wheeler here. He summarizes one of the key points here, that while every data set or every metric contains noise, or meaning just this kind of regular fluctuation, some data sets may contain signals. Therefore, before we can detect signals, and those are the things that we should react to, you must first filter out the noise. And thankfully, we don't have to guess what is a signal. We don't have to guess what's noise. We can use a tool, a statistical tool that's pretty simple. You can do this in Excel. It's called a process behavior chart. So let me take a look at book sales here. As they say in the tech world, I try to eat my own dog food. I try to practice what I preach. And of course, I have metrics about a book about metrics. So if you go into Amazon, in the KDP platform, their beta version of their reports will let you take a look at daily book sales in two different ways. You can view it. The default is what you see here. They call this a column chart. I'm of the camp who prefers to see the view, and you can click and toggle and say, well, I want to view what would either be called a line chart in Excel, or you could call this a run chart. There are some experts in visualization and data who say, if you look at the chart on the top, your eye is actually drawn to the middle of the bar, where with the line chart or the run chart at the bottom, your eye is drawn to the dot that's actually the data point. So some of this might be preference as opposed to really established science. But I can take this data from Amazon, and if I plot it in Excel, again, this is what you might call a run chart. And now you can even start seeing, maybe intuitively, instead of looking at a report that says, well, book sales are down 12% from the week before, or book sales are up 21% from the month before. When we plot the dots, when we just look at a chart, well, you maybe start to see just intuitively that, the number fluctuates. Sometimes I'm going to sell apparently 5 books a day. Sometimes I sell 1 or 0. Maybe I shouldn't get too excited or too freaked out about any of those numbers if they're all in the realm of noise. So as we create a process behavior chart, we start with a run chart. And again, this is really easy to do in Excel. The first thing you do is simply calculate an average, and you draw that line in the chart. So when we have a metric that's just fluctuating around an average, this won't be precisely true, but you tend to have half your data points above the average and half your data points below. Anyone who still remembers Garrison Keillor, and we can't have all the children being above average, and every day of book sales isn't going to be above average either. But we can understand the fluctuation and look for trends and do things to try to increase performance. So we have our average, and then the next thing we do, I got off track here. We calculate something that's called an upper natural process limit. So with a metric like this, the lower limit is essentially 0. If I had higher book sales, I might end up with red lines that appear above and below the average. They would be symmetrical, and these are what we call the lower and the upper natural process limits. So this number of 6.88 is calculated. I'm going to spare you the details of that. If you're interested in the exact details, I can share a spreadsheet template. I can point you to a blog post that shows you how the calculations are done. But this is calculated based on the amount of day-to-day fluctuation in this metric. This is not a goal. This is not a hope or a target. This chart and the math behind it tells me going forward that unless I figure out how to improve this system through marketing efforts or PR or speaking engagements, that if I continue doing what I'm doing, that this daily sales number is going to fluctuate basically randomly between about 0 and 7. So we would look at this and say any of these data points here are noise. There's no explanation. It's not a good use of time. It would be a waste of time to ask, well, why didn't I sell any books yesterday? There's no single reason or root cause for that, other than, well, the sales fluctuate. So we call this a predictable metric. Now, I might not like the average level of sales. I might want it to be higher. But the good news, the good news is I can predict going forward, I'm probably going to sell about 2.5 books a day. So if I want to improve my book sales, the answer is not found in asking about any particular day. Well, what happened on the day when I sold 5? It's probably nothing different. So I think what happens especially in organizations, people get trapped in the cycle of being overly reactive. And they're asking, what went wrong last month? When the metric is just fluctuating and there is no answer to that question of, well, what went wrong last month? Because nothing changed. So we need to step back and try to be a little bit more systematic instead of being reactive in how we try to improve what we're doing. So this is a different metric, but it's meant to illustrate a chart where we have a metric in the blue line. We've got a green line that's an average. And then we have our calculated symmetrical lower and upper natural process limits. So there are basically 3 rules that we could use for finding if something is a signal, meaning it's an unusual occurrence. It means something changed and it is worth asking why. So anytime we have a data point above or below the limits, that means something's different. It's worth understanding what that is. Mm-hmm. If we see 8 consecutive points on the same side of the average, that's indicative that the average level of performance has shifted. And then there's another rule that says, well, if you see a cluster of data points kind of closer to the limit than the average, that's also a signal that says this is, statistically speaking, not just random fluctuation, that something is different. But now if we look at book sales, one of the challenges with process behavior charts is that they'll tell us something changed. It doesn't mean that we know what changed. It might be because of something we're doing. It might be because of external factors that we actually don't have control over. But let me go back to some different process behavior charts for my book. So here was, very early on. This was actually right before I did the launch on the ebook, which was on August 4th. So here was a chart where it was kind of fluctuating within this range. And then I had not 1, but 2 consecutive data points. Book sales were above the upper natural process limit for that time period. So actually that first data point, both these data points are a signal where it would be a good use of time to ask what changed. As an author, I have no idea what led to that spike in book sales. Was it because somebody read it and recommended it to everybody in their company? I don't know. But looking at this chart, what I don't know yet is this a temporary fluctuation, or is this a beginning of a shift upward where book sales are now going to be fluctuating around an average of 25 a day, perhaps? So, we continue looking at our metric. We can also look at metrics instead of daily sales, we could look at weekly sales. So you can see it was fluctuating. That spike of those couple of days turned out to be a temporary effect. and it went back to fluctuating around an average. So, we might have, we'd say we've got a signal here, so maybe there was this 5-week period, and that was really around the launch. So maybe that's not surprising that there's more hype or promotion. People are waiting for the book to launch instead of doing pre-orders. So maybe there's a good explanation for why sales were higher, and now it appears to have settled in around an average. So then later last year, I started working with a PR firm that specializes in helping authors. And so part of my hope and my hypothesis is that hiring a PR firm will increase book sales and maybe get me more speaking engagements and do things that are good for my business. But the question to be answered over time is, will that have an effect, and how quickly should I expect that to have an effect? So all I can do is continue adding data points to the chart. And as this chart continues through the second week of January, well, unfortunately, book sales haven't gone up. They've actually gone down. So I have 8 consecutive weeks with below average sales. That's a signal that says, whether I like it or not, the average is lower. I could try to do things about that. I probably shouldn't overreact and fire the PR firm. It's probably not a good cause and effect assumption to say, well, I hired the PR firm and book sales dropped. That's probably not what happened. It's probably more a matter that the hopefully the positive effect of the PR efforts haven't kicked in yet. So what I've done is, on my process behavior chart, where it used to fluctuate around this average, and it had basically a lower limit of 0 and upper limit of 50 books a week. Now my expectation is that it's fluctuating around this lower average, and it's fluctuating between these numbers here. So I can make a prediction going forward, because this is what we call a predictable metric. Even though there's been a shift in performance, going forward, it appears that it's going to continue fluctuating within that range, unless I can figure out how to get more exposure for the book. When my paperback is done and hopefully available at the end of March, I'm hoping that's going to have a positive effect on total book sales, and I'll look and see what happens on the chart. So I want to go back and revisit a couple of the other charts and data that I showed earlier. So I'll go back to Google Analytics and my blog traffic. So what I did was plotted this data over time. And when I create a process behavior chart from it, we'd see, well, it appears that it was fluctuating around an average. And then we have this downward, unfortunately, downward shift in performance, where we started off not only with 8 consecutive data points below the average, it is probably about 20 data points below the average. So whether I like it or not, I would probably represent that reality as saying, well, blog traffic has dropped. It's now fluctuating within a little bit narrower range until it did this. It jumped back up a bit around a higher average. So this could be due to a number of things. It could be maybe I was writing blog posts that were on topics that were more interesting to people. Maybe the Google search analytics changed, or the formula for what web pages they showed changed in some way. And then it dropped over the holidays. So we could maybe represent the process behavior chart like this, where we see, again, a shift downward, maybe a shift back upward, and as 2019 continues, my prediction is that here with the holidays, that was a temporary effect that goes away, and that traffic is going to continue fluctuating around that green number. Mm-hmm. Let me share just a couple of examples before wrapping up, and I want to hear your thoughts and have time for some Q&A. I'm sitting in the offices right now of a software company called KaiNexus, and one of the things I do for KaiNexus is manage their webinar series. So I play host, and I recruit people to give presentations. Sometimes I give presentations. And one of the things we do, of course, is we track the number of registrations. And when you apply the process behavior chart methodology, going back over 4+ years of webinars, you can see there's a green dashed line. That's our average number of registrations. So for the most part, we've got a lot of noise. And within the KaiNexus team, and I write about this in the book a little bit, I've helped our marketing director and our CEO and some of our salespeople who look at a lot of metrics start understanding the difference between signal and noise. You know, when we do weekly conference calls, there's far less discussion around things like, well, our web traffic number dropped a little bit last week. We stop asking for explanations of the noise, and we tend to look at more charts instead of giving 2 data point comparisons. And I think everyone in the company agrees that it's ended up saving a lot of time when we stop overreacting and over-explaining every change, uptick or downtick in a metric. But you'll notice there's one webinar from last January that you could call an outlier, or in this methodology, we would call it a signal. We had one webinar that had almost 750 registrations. So this is the point where it actually is worthwhile to ask what changed. What was different? Was it a higher profile speaker? Was it the topic that really resonated? Did we do something different in how we promoted the webinars to our customers and on social media? Because when we have a signal, we want to understand what happened. So hopefully, we want to ask the question, can we recreate the magic, if you will, that happened here? And I'll tell you, we did 2 more webinars with the same presenter. We did one a couple of months later, and we did one just this past month. We couldn't recreate whatever happened here. Was kind of magic in a bottle that we don't understand, which is, I hate to say, you don't understand how your business is working. But here, we can say we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 webinars in a row that were above average. That could be just more random fluctuation. Or, if our next 4 webinars are all, at about 275 or above, we might say we've shifted our level of performance upward. But, there's that general business lesson, going back to the subtitle of the book. When we react less, we can save time, we can lead better, we can focus our efforts in more systematic ways of improving. A couple examples from the news. If we look at the college football playoff that we just had here in January, we see a lot of headlines like this about different metrics and numbers in the news. Ratings for the college football playoff hit a new low. Like, oh, well, obviously college football is far less popular than it had been. Like, what's the context for a statement like this? So here's a process behavior chart. And even though it only has 5 data points, so you'd say all-time low, okay, well, that's only, any number out of 5 years worth of ratings is inevitably going to be the lowest number ever. But when we plot it as a process behavior chart, I draw the conclusion that says all those data points are noise, that the number is just fluctuating around an average. And it could be fluctuating due to the day of the week it's held on. Well, I think it's always on a Monday now, so that's not a variable. It could be a little bit of, what teams are involved. But the reality is, in the news articles, people were throwing out all kinds of ideas that people are sick of Alabama. Clemson's in a relatively small town. And there's all these explanations that probably it's just filling up space in the newspaper or filling up minutes on ESPN. If I were running ESPN or the college football playoff, I wouldn't freak out about that decline because, again, it sounds really dramatic to say, oh, it's an all-time low, but the number really wasn't much lower than 2017. The number goes up, the number goes down. I'm not trying to get political, but we saw headlines in November. Americans turned out to vote at a level not seen in more than a century. Well, that sounds impressive, or it sounds like a dramatic level of civic participation. Civil, that was a slip. Maybe things aren't so civil, but we have civic engagement. If we go back to 1974, here's actually a case when you draw the process behavior chart. that shows, well, the number had been fluctuating around an average of about 40%. 2018 voter participation was a signal. So we could ask, and we'll just leave this to everybody to think about, what changed? So here's a case where one headline says, lowest ratings ever. That's not meaningful. Here's one that says highest voter turnout in more than a century. That time, that was meaningful. And the process behavior chart helps us tell the difference, again, between signal and noise. Last example, because I blogged about the Oscars and that goof up. Here's a headline from last year where they didn't screw up who announcing the Best Picture winner. Record low ratings. So again, we ask that question of, well, does record low mean it's a significant difference from recent years? I mean, it says ratings fell 19%. I don't know if based on the popularity of different movies, hosts, or other factors, I don't know if those ratings normally go up and down 19% every year. Is this like our weight fluctuating day to day, or is that a meaningful difference? So what can we do? We can draw a process behavior chart. So if we go back to the 90s, Oscars ratings, 30% of people with televisions turned on, I think, were watching the Oscars. So it's a percentage of viewers. So it's meant to scale as our population grows. You can see in the 90s, it was just fluctuating around an average. But then we hit a point starting maybe in about 2001 where we're fluctuating around a new lower average. So the fact that 1 year's ratings are really low maybe isn't the thing we should be paying attention to. We'd say there's a signal, and instead of asking why were the ratings low in 2018, the better question to ask would be, well, why did the average drop starting in 2001? And there's all kinds of theories about the continued expansion of cable television, and now it's all the streaming services and the cord cutters, and there might be good reasons there. But here's an example of where a process behavior chart points us to the longer term trend instead of just trying to explain last year's number. So I hope that's helpful. I think the general idea here is, when we learn to react less, we waste less time, we can focus our efforts, we can lead our people differently, and we can actually improve more. So less reactive analysis, more systemic improvement. I sit back and instead of asking, again, why did book sales drop last week? I'm trying to do things that improve the system. Creating a paperback book is one example. I hope the PR efforts pay off and that leads to an increase in sales. And again, the process behavior chart will tell me if that's really happening. So if you want some more of the detail about the math or how this happens, or if you want to actually try creating a process behavior chart, my book's website has a spreadsheet template that you can download. There's a blog post on the KaiNexus website. I probably should have this content on my own website, but since I'm involved with KaiNexus, we partnered up on some of this content. You can Google this title or just Google Mark Graban KaiNexus control chart, or ask Kathy. I'll send the link, or you can reach out and email me if you want that. So there's barfing out about 35 minutes of presentation. I'm curious what you think, what your reactions are, what questions or ideas you might have to share.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, as an obsessive compulsive type myself, I think this is really, really helpful, because I know I have been overly obsessed with looking at different metrics over my career, and especially as an author. So this has been really, really helpful. I'm curious as to what are the things that you pay attention to the most? What are the things that you look at each month or each quarter, and give us an idea of how frequently too you look at some of these measures?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to scale back on the habit of looking at some of these metrics too closely. Web traffic anymore, like on my blog or I haven't gone and looked at the web traffic for the book website, which is separate from my blog. Maybe I should do that. Anymore, usually it's that monthly email from Google that sort of triggers me to go in and look at the longer term trends instead of just being happy or upset about the up or the down. Because here's the thing, every month the number is either higher or lower than it was the month before. But with book sales, I will admit to pulling up the Kindle reports page once or twice a day. But I think the difference is, in how you react to it, right? So there's a lot of articles, if you, again, looking at the number on your scale. There are some experts who say, well, you should only weigh yourself weekly because then you're not freaking out about the daily up and down. So that's one strategy. Or if you weigh yourself daily, I think you can teach yourself. Maybe easier said than done. I've taught myself to not freak out about the daily up and down. So some people might feel more comfortable in saying, you know what, I only care about the longer term trend and I'm only going to weigh myself weekly. I would agree with the related advice that says don't weigh yourself multiple times a day because your weight will fluctuate even more across the course of the day. So, the one practice behind that chart I drew was that I weigh myself first thing in the morning because that eliminates the variable of weight fluctuations within the day. So.
Again, Mark, really, really great job.
Right. Thanks, Kathy.
Always enjoy your sessions. I always feel like I learn a whole bunch. I have a couple pages of notes here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Make it a good week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.